Welcome back. This is our second session of the third annual George E. Danis seminar on security and diplomacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And our theme this week and this seminar is insurgent, in quotations, I guess, after our first speaker this morning, nationalism in a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean. And we have with us Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, who will take us through this process of nationalism within the framework of religion and geopolitics, and look at some global trends. Dr. Prodromou is a good friend and somebody that has worked as a collaborator and worked together in putting this seminar together over the last few years, and I'm very, very grateful for her friendship and her scholarship and collaboration. She's currently visiting scholar in the International Studies program at Boston College, where she will join the faculty beginning the forthcoming academic year. Her research interest and policy work focuses on the intersections of geopolitics, religion, and human rights, with particular focus in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Prodromou has served as a diplomatic appointment on the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom from 2004 to 2012. And she was a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group from 2011 to 2015. She's co-editor of 2 volumes, Eastern Orthodox Christianity and American Higher Education, the Theological, Historical, and Contemporary Reflections, and Thinking Through Faith, Perspectives from Orthodox Christian Scholars, and multiple book chapters, and is widely published in academic journals such as Journal of World Christianity, Journal of Democracy, Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Orbis, and Survival. She is the she's on the editorial board of the Review of Faith International and International Affairs and the Journal of World Christianity, and co-chairs the Orthodoxy, Politics, and International Relations Group of the International Orthodox Theological Association. Her current policy and practitioner appointments include non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, non-resident senior fellow, as well as Religions for Peace co-president, and the Freedom of Religion or Belief Women's Alliance as an alliance advisor. Her current research focuses on 2 areas: religious geopolitics and typologies of power, drawing on her work on Russian influence building through religious soft and sharp power, and the effects of cultural heritage policy on institutions, religions, freedom, and religious pluralism, with comparative case studies from the Near East. She has taught at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, where she was the founding faculty director of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, at Boston University, Princeton University, and as an invited flying faculty member at the College of Europe Anatolian campus. She earned a PhD and an SM in political science from MIT, and a Master's of Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and a BA in History and International Relations from Tufts University, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude. So as you can tell from this abbreviated bio, we have with us somebody that could really enlighten us on the issues at hand, which is this idea of nationalism, and the question raised whether it's insurgent or not. But even from looking at it from for a deep and steep knowledge of religion and how that interacts in the region of the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean. Elizabeth, thank you for accepting our invitation, and once again, really being a partner in all of this as we are moving forward and looking at the region. Thank you.
Congratulations with all. We are very proud of you.
Well, Petro, Dr. Vamakas, and Mr. Danis, and to all of those of you who are listening. Petro, I asked you just to read a few lines from my bio. So for all of you on screen, probably I've now cured you of any insomnia you may have. since you have to listen to my bio. But anyway, thank you for the gracious introduction. Thank you to Dr. Vamakas and the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies at Emmanuel for the opportunity to speak with you this year. And thank you also to Mr. Danis for his generous support for the Institute. So it's really wonderful to be with all of you today. I've actually changed my presentation to a good degree after hearing Dr. Milonas's presentation this morning. It was really a kind of tour de horizon, of resurgent nationalism. And while there will be some overlap, I thought that perhaps there could be some utility in spending a little time on, digging down into the origins of the phenomenon that we're discussing this entire week, which is nationalism. If we understand its origins and evolution, we can then maybe have, a very fulsome discussion about whether or not it's indeed resurgent, whether nationalism ever disappeared from the international system, if there's something particular and different about the current moment and expressions of nationalism in our world, and also most specifically about where religion figures into the phenomenon of nationalism. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the first part of this talk. And then the second part, I'm going to look at some examples, diverse examples of the intersection between religion and nationalism. And we can unpack those in more detail in questions that you may have. But I want to start with 4 questions that you as students of contemporary nationalism, and especially for those of you who are interested regionally in the East Med, but more broadly, may want to keep in mind as we go through this whole week, okay? So I'll give you the 4 questions and then I'll turn to my, my presentation. The first question is, and these questions relate to my presentation, how do we talk about nationalism? What's the nomenclature or the system of names and terms that we use to discuss nationalism? And specifically, where does religion figure into that nomenclature, okay? And the ways in which policymakers, scholars, and practitioners understand and design and manage that relationship between religion and nationalism. So how do we talk about nationalism, okay? What's our vocabulary? And what understanding does that vocabulary provide us? 2, why are we talking about resurgent nationalism? And this is something, again, that came up in this morning's presentation by Professor Milonas, as though nationalism ever disappeared from the current international system. So is there something different about the current forms of nationalism, or have we missed things all along, okay? The third question for you to keep in mind, how does nationalism fit into geopolitics? Again, these are 2 terms we use all the time, nationalism and geopolitics, but are we using them with the same definitions? And here I want to ask us to keep in mind that geopolitics as a term means the relationship between geography and politics. And when we talk about geography, we want to keep in mind different types of geography. So maybe we should be thinking about geographies in the plural. We can talk about physical geography, whether territorial or spatial. And we can also talk about geographies of identity, okay? So where does nationalism in its current expressions relate to how we think about geopolitics and shape the relationship between geography and politics? And then the 4th question I would ask us to keep in mind for today and the week is, what are some examples of the intersection of religion and nationalism that can help us to understand both positive and negative interactions between these 2 forms of community, communities of faith or religious or transcendent belief, and the political community of the nation? Okay, I would add a footnote to these questions. Why are nationalism and religion in a lot of quarters kind of dirty words in policy, media, and academic spaces? So these are the 4 big questions. Keep these in mind like a film running in the background as I now turn to the first part of my talk, which is to say a little bit about the origins of the vocabulary that we use, okay, to think about nationalism. And here I would say two things to keep in mind. First of all, that this vocabulary is relatively recent, because when we talk about the phenomenon of nationalism, the nation as a political community, and we think in terms of long history, we realize that the history of nationalism is really only about half a millennium in length. Now, that sounds, very long, but in the grand scheme of the longue durée of history, when we think about the origins of nationalism, we're talking about a relatively compressed period of time. And I'm going to give you 5 dates that I think will help you to think about how nationalism has evolved in this half a millennium or so. And again, these are somewhat arbitrary, but you'll see that they make sense, and many of them may be familiar to you, okay? So the 5 dates, and by the way, please put any questions in the chat, and then Petro, you can stop me at a certain point and we can, look at any questions. And then I'll continue. So the 5 dates are as follows: 1555, 1648, 1776, 1789, and 1989. And again, we could plug others in, but these are the key dates. If you had to write on a napkin 5 dates that make sense for you in terms of thinking about nationalism and the vocabulary that we use to discuss it, I would tell you to look at those dates, okay? Now let me say a little bit about each one. What's 1555? For those of you who are IR majors, hopefully these are all familiar dates. 1555 is the Peace of Augsburg. That's also called the Augsburg Settlement, right? And the Peace of Augsburg, what was it? Okay, it was a treaty between the Holy Roman Emperor and a military alliance amongst Protestant kings. So here already religion's in the picture. Roman Catholic, Holy Roman Emperor, and a military alliance among Protestant kings, at that time Lutherans, or overwhelmingly Lutherans. For historians amongst you, that's the Schmalkaldic League, okay? And the treaty was signed between the Holy Roman Emperor and this alliance of Protestant kings. And what did it do in the imperial city of Augsburg, today in southern Germany? It ended the religious war between these two groups, okay? And it legalized the division of Western Christianity, okay, into territories. And Augsburg was important because, again, it ended this first round of wars that were driven by religion. They were wars within religion, within Western Christianity, that had geopolitical consequences, okay? And the Peace of Augsburg gave rise to a concept that, again, many of you may have heard about, but for us thinking about the proto-origins of nationalism and the relationship to religion, keep this in mind. For those of you who struggled through high school Latin, as I did, cuius regio, eius religio. Whose realm? Cuius regio, his religion, eius religio. And what does that mean? Simply, Augsburg meant that the princes of states within the Holy Roman Empire could adopt either Lutheran Christianity or Catholic, Roman Catholic Christianity within their territorial space, okay? So here we see the emergence of the idea of the territorialization of religion. We see the emergence of the idea of the sovereign determining the collective identity, the religious identity within the territory that he controlled, where his subjects lived. So here we're seeing the emergence of the really, really deep ideas about the nation and the state, okay? And here we're talking about nations still largely defined, or political community, the subjects of this political community. They're not citizens, they're subjects, right? Understood still in religious terms, and territorialized and controlled by a sovereign, okay? So we begin to see the idea of sovereignty as a territorial entity as well, okay? So this is why Augsburg is really important for our thinking, okay? Now, we could, add in so much more detail here, but, Augsburg was also important because it formalized what was happening in Western Europe with the denominalization of Christianity. That began with the Protestant Reformation. Remember Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, okay? And the Protestant Reformation, why is it called Protestant? It's a protest demanding the reforms inside the Roman Catholic Church, okay? So Augsburg is a response to something that's happening in religion, but that has implications for sovereignty, for political leadership, for political authority, and for territory, and for boundaries and borders, and for collective identity within those borders. So that's the first date. The second date is the Peace of Westphalia, 1648. And here I'm giving you, again, an absurdly reductionist, treatment of the Peace of Westphalia, but useful enough, I hope, for our purposes. So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 is actually a set of treaties, all signed also in Germany, okay? And again, what did the Peace of Westphalia do? It ended wars among Western European monarchs, everywhere from Spain to the Netherlands, to what's contemporary Germany and Italy, to France, to Sweden. And it ended the 30 Years' War and the long 80 Years' Wars that were related to religion and the control of territory. And Westphalia was really crucial because it consolidated and clarified many of the emergent features of the state system, the state as a territorialized entity, okay, of political community, but it shifted away very markedly from religion as the primary signifier of political community. Now, what happened at Westphalia? It provided that all of the parties, all of the signatories to the treaties would recognize Augsburg, okay, barely a century before, 90 years or so before. It also had all these interesting pieces about Christians of non-dominant denominations. So, for example, where the previous treaty had dealt with Roman Catholics and Lutheran Protestants, now Calvinist Protestants were included. But again, we're thinking Western Europe, so very specific geographical space, and Western Christianity, very specific religious tradition, okay? And what the treaties did is it guaranteed all of these communities to the right to practice their faith. And again, it gave exclusive sovereignty, okay, to political sovereigns who oftentimes work in combination with religious sovereigns, but we're beginning to see the tension between and the division between political sovereignty, temporal, as we say, secular in this world sovereignty, and religious sources of authority and sovereignty, namely church leaders, okay? Now, other key points. Westphalia clarified the concept of territorial sovereignty, borders and their inviolability. So we begin again to see here that the territorialization that goes with collective political identity, the emergence of the concept of the inviolability and respect for the inviolability of borders, recognizing that's how you're not going to have continuous cycles of violence and war, okay? And the gradual replacement of the hegemony of religion, in this case, Western Christianity, with the hegemony of a political sovereign or ruler. Okay, so Westphalia is important because now we begin to see not only the vocabulary emerge about sovereignty, territoriality, borders, and inviolability, but we also begin to see introduced into the vocabulary that we now use for nationalism and the state, the terms secular and religious, or temporal and religious. Okay, and if you know this, hackneyed quote by now, we see the separation of God and Caesar in terms of spiritual and temporal forms of time and authority, okay? not fully resolved, but again, we're beginning to see the emergence of our vocabulary that we use today. Now, let me fast forward a little to 1776 and 1789, because our vocabulary begins to be filled out, and also these ideas of the state and political community become clearer with regard to religion and religious sources of authority. 1776, the American Revolution. 1789, the French Revolution, okay? Both of them are important for two reasons when we think about nationalism. First, they clarify the concept of what popular sovereignty. So here we see a rejection, an explicit rejection of the old order, whereby people were subjects, and we see the emergence of the idea of citizens, right? And so the sovereign, who was the monarch and unaccountable to his subjects, is now replaced or being replaced by the idea of a sovereign who is accountable to his citizenry, right? So we see the emergence of the revolutionary idea of popular sovereignty, both in the American Revolution. I want to read you a quote from the Declaration of Independence. One of the founding principles of the United States of America was that legitimate governments are what? Those deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, okay? So sovereignty is clarified again in terms of a reinforcement of territorial notions of the state, but the sovereign is now a sovereign responsible to those who live within that territory, the political community residing in the territory, accountable to and responsible to the popular sovereignty, okay? And the French Revolution continues, to reinforce this trend. As we know, the French Revolution, caused by really just overwhelming disgust with the French aristocracy and the economic policies of King Louis XVI, right? And his wife, Maria, the famous, infamous, I guess, Marie Antoinette. So these 18th century events help, again, clarify our vocabulary of sovereignty understood in terms of territory, political community understood in terms of either religion or something else, and we're not quite sure what that may mean, ethnicity, language, race, tribe, okay? And we see here emerge these competing forms of identity, political identity and community. And also we see this emergence of the idea of popular sovereignty, also known as democracy, okay? And with that, we are seeing by the end of the 18th century, the explicit end of the old order. And by that, we mean large imperial states, whether in the form of colonies, extra-European colonies, or in the European and Eurasian context, the end of large empires like the Habsburg, the Ottoman, and the Russia, okay? So by the end of the 18th century, then the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, with the end of these empires, our vocabulary, our conceptual apparatus, and the organization of the structure of the world in terms of nation states is becoming very clear. And with that, the significance of religion vis-a-vis this new order is central to how we understand who is the sovereign, who belongs to a political community. Is it organized according to identity criteria, religion, or something else? Or is it organized according to civic rights criteria, okay? And we also begin to see this architecture of the religion-state relationship that we oftentimes talk about in terms of secularization. What's the relationship between religious institutions and leaders on the one hand, and state institutions and leaders on the other? What role does religion play in the public space? And is religion a source of social cohesion or social disintegration? And then fast forward to the last date, and I'll end this first part, and we can talk about any questions you may have. The last date I would have you put on your napkin when it comes to our our nomenclature or our vocabulary for nationalism is 1989. And why do I pick 1989? Because 1989, as you all know, and probably most of you still weren't even born yet, but that's the end of the Cold War, okay? That's the consolidation, the period when we see the consolidation of the European project, either intergovernmental or transnational. It's also the period, the date that ushers in really the kind of globalization of neoliberal economic ideology and technologies of globalization. And it also is the watershed moment where we see the emergence of two competing perspectives on what the world will look like after 1989. Either the triumph of democracy and the end of identity forms of politics. So nationalism as an identity concept being replaced by nationalism as a rights concept. And even a move beyond territorialized nationalism to the idea of cosmopolitanism, okay? The idea that, yes, physical geography matters, but we all belong to this community, human community, okay? The idea that in moral and socio-political terms, regardless of anyone's, affiliation or identity, we're all citizens in a single global community. That's one perspective that emerges from the events of 1989. So in some ways, a move beyond nationalism, and that helps us understand why, we're talking about this notion of resurgent nationalism. Or the other alternative, the first one is associated with people like Francis Fukuyama, with Sheila Ben Habib, Fukuyama's end of history argument, Sheila Ben Habib's work, fantastic work on cosmopolitanism. The second perspective that comes out of the 1989 events and all of the features of it, okay, of that year, is the idea of a return or a move to a renewed form of identity politics, political communities based on nation or civilization. And that's the Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations argument. That yes, we may move beyond nationalism, but the logics of nationalism, which are rooted in exclusivist forms, what we say ascriptive categories of identity, those that are immutable, will continue in the form of these civilizational groupings that include ethnicity, race, language, tribe. So these are the two worldviews that emerge that again form part of our contemporary vocabulary, our nomenclature, in thinking about nationalism. And in terms of the 1989 events and those two competing views, clearly the cosmopolitan view sees religion as receding or as needing to be marginalized and privatized so that we can all belong to the same human community, our faith commitments or self-identification. And the other, the civilizational form, predicting that religion will become more important, but how? As a source of division and conflict, and therefore as something that needs to be managed, tamed, privatized, marginalized. So religion runs across all five of these dates. It runs throughout the vocabulary that has developed to talk about nationalism, but it runs in a complicated fashion, okay? And here I'll give you some takeaways and stop. First of all, state, nation, civic and ethnic, rights and identity, secular, religious, sovereignty, legitimacy, democracy. All of these terms that we use to discuss nationalism originated in this short time span from 1555 to the present, okay? Second, we can't take into account and think about nationalism and its origins without recognizing that religion figures into this history, okay? These are the two, I think, big takeaways for us from this, first part of the talk. So I'll stop here. Petro, if you would like to, intervene, and if there are any questions, and then I'm going to turn to deconstruct our vocabulary and think of the ways we use it in some examples. And I want to talk a little bit about Russia and Ukraine. I want to talk a little bit about Turkey. I want to talk a little bit about India and a little bit about the United States. And these are just, easy examples for us to discuss, but there are myriad others that we can touch
upon. If people have questions, please raise them. In the meantime, just I really appreciate the historical framing, even from an international relations perspective. I think it would have been a great primer for most of my students who are doing international relations. I like the framing that you provided. And I think part of it is sort of like, the way that we have subconsciously divided or taken out any kind of a religiosity from our civic argumentation as a society. We tend to look at the separation of church and state as sort of like this negation of the church altogether, or any kind of a religious aspect. So we don't necessarily look at the religious framing where we are politically today. And I think I thank you for re-engaging that conversation and then picking it up at the end of 1989 and framing the 1990s argument from Habib to Fukuyama to Huntington in that way, because we tend to by doing so, we have put this nationalism or religion on the margin. And it seems that engaging in that will make us not necessarily progressive, or looking at progressive as a value-added thing, like a positive versus a negative. We put values on some of this argumentation, and the terms have gotten more value-laden characteristics rather than what they are and what they mean. So I do appreciate also you spelling out and using those terms and saying, okay, well, these are all terms that have been existed in this time. So I like the way that you engage the conversation by having this framing, the theoretical framing. So I don't know if the audience also is on that same wavelength.
Thank you. I don't know, are there any things in the chat? No questions in the chat. Okay. Can I just, also clarify a couple of things? I think there are some myths that are associated with the emergence of the nation state as that relates to religion, right? And I think the first, myth is that the emergence and consolidation of the nation state has meant the disappearance of religion, okay? And so the term secular comes in here. And that somehow with the formation of the nation state, nation as a political community displaces other forms of collective identity or political community, and that could be religious, number one. And in fact, what we see is that nations, as they have emerged and importantly evolved over time, I think we need to keep in mind always that the content of the nation changes over time. And I think migration today and the globality of people on the move and the pluralization of our societies worldwide is generating a demand for a more elastic form and an adaptable form of nation. So we need to get beyond this myth that somehow here comes the nation as a political community and the collective community of religious identity somehow either disappears, recedes, goes to the private space, or, and as part of that, should have no place in the public sphere, okay? So there's a both descriptive and a normative component to this idea of the nation as a secularizing project. It's far more messy and complicated than that. That's number one. And number two, as part of that, this sort of the mythology that states that emerge that ultimately do political sovereigns displace religious sovereigns as the hegemonic form of authority in our world, that somehow that has meant that a complete separation of religion and state. And I would urge your students who are watching to read a really fantastic article by the late Alfred Stepan, the late Yale political scientist, Alfred Stepan. And that was published in the Journal of Democracy. I think it was like the mid to late 1990s, and the exact date escapes me. But what Stepan does in that beautiful article, just so kind of synoptically written, is he says, this idea that, secular states have emerged and are some sort of ideal type in Western Europe primarily, and that all these other places that Huntington in particular references haven't really, their states are weak because they're not secular. He says is a dramatic oversimplification and a mistaken understanding of the empirical reality. And he says, take, for example, the case of France or the case of the UK, right? The British and the French models are oftentimes held up as ideal types of secular states. And he says, if we actually look at the religion state arrangements in both of those, we see that there's a kind of modus vivendi that has emerged between religious institutions and the functions they perform and state institutions and the ones that they perform. And that modus vivendi helps to explain the type of nationalism, inclusive or exclusive, or the tensions about inclusivity and exclusivity that we've seen in the UK and France over time. But he says, let's not make the mistake of thinking that somehow the Notre Dame Cathedral in France, right, because it now falls under the management of the Ministry of Culture, still isn't a church and a cathedral, and still doesn't have, religious resonance in a French political community nation that is becoming ever more politically, culturally diverse and religiously pluralized. So he asks us to think in, more kind of nimble and nuanced ways about, religion-state relations and the consequent content of nationalism and how we measure the religious features of nationalism and the impact of religion on what I think we all care about, which is equality before the state and legal regimes that allow and protect human dignity individually or collectively. Because regardless of the value that you may put or reject when it comes to religious identity, everyone is equal before the state. So take a look at that Stepan piece.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Stepan's piece, and I think it's it's almost like he writes this before we framed the 2000s with this whole idea with Islam, and sort of we associate any kind of religious things in this sort of religious, non-religious. And I think what we have undertaken in the last 25 years really does not allow us to get into this, this discussion that you just very well just outlined for us. And I think that that's part of the problem. So even if we were to to recreate the title of this seminar, instead of resurgent nationalism, what's percolating in my mind is this whole idea of recasting nationalism, right? Recasting nationalism in a way of also creating the sense of civic engagement in a completely different manner, because we tend to put it in different boxes. And if I'm hearing you correctly this morning, and and I agree, is we need to sort of look at that nuance, because in that process of separating them completely out, we've lost a whole bunch of ways and dimensions of nation building, which are very, very pertinent to talking about other things like sovereignty, legitimacy, democracy, all the terms that you just outlined. But I'm very cognizant of the time, so I'm going to let you go, and then if everybody else wants to jump in, we can do that afterwards, so we can stay within that 1:30 2:30 time.
Okay.
The floor is yours,
great.
Elizabeth.
Okay, great. And I'll try to keep this to 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you almost a thumbnail sketch of these cases, right? And again, I want us to keep in mind these, ideas about two types of political community. One that is defined according to citizenship and equality before the state. Okay, so that means that the state and its judiciary, in particular, its legal judicial institutions and frameworks, see everyone as equal, or political communities that are defined in terms of overwhelmingly in terms of identity categories, and that in our case, we're thinking about religion, but it may be others, okay? So let me give some examples. The first one, which we read about every day and we all are problematizing about, is the Russian war in Ukraine. Okay, and what are, again, I'm just going to highlight some pieces from what I've said thus far about that war. What do we see? That, Russia's war in Ukraine, amongst other things, is premised on a civilizational articulation of nationalism. Okay, it maintains that there's only a single Russian nation, part of a Russian civilization or Russian world, Ruski Mir, okay, that's comprised of, and there are internal tensions, by the way, in the concept, but I'm giving you, again, this sort of thumbnail sketch. The Russian world is comprised of Russian speakers in the current states of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, okay? Now this, Ruski Mir, or Russian world, Russian civilization argument, as currently articulated by the Kremlin and the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Church, incorporates religion very explicitly and deliberately. So how so? Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill Gundayev, says, as does the Kremlin, okay, that membership in this Russian civilization, part of the civilizational ancestry of the Russian world dates back to Kievan Rus, to Kiev, to the capital of contemporary Ukraine, okay, which embraces Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and that informs ideas about what it means to be Russian, to belong to the civilization that's Russian, and in the nation state period to the Russian nationalism, okay? This Russian world notion also turns on the idea of Moscow as a third Rome, which itself is a distortion of the idea of Rome as the first Rome, Constantinople as the new Rome, never the second Rome, the new Rome. And now the Moscow Patriarchate says Moscow is the third Rome, okay? The inheritor of Christendom, okay? And of a pristine, authentic form of Christianity that is under siege by Western civilization. And Western civilization, what's that a shorthand for? Godless secularism and all that goes along with that, according to Kirill and Putin. All right. Now, what do we see here in terms of the relationship between religion, nation, religious community, political community? All sorts of cohesion, but all sorts of tensions. We see that state borders and religious borders don't coincide, right? We have competing geographies. On the one hand, we have, Moscow saying that state borders need to be revised on the basis of this Russian world concept. So the three states, the three sovereign states, or respect for the territorial integrity of Ukraine and even Belarus, is called into question by this transnational civilizational form of identity in which religion, in this case, Russian Orthodoxy, figures very prominently. At the same time, this raises very interesting questions about what's happening inside Russia, for example, where we see, in the case of Russia, 4 traditional religions. These are recognized by the state: Orthodoxy, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. But there are countless others. It also raises questions about the religious pluralism that we see in Ukraine. For example, competing Orthodox denominations, the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was part of the Moscow Patriarchate. We also see Greek Catholic Christians in Ukraine. We see Muslims in Ukraine. We see Jews in Ukraine. We see others, Protestants and others, and we see non-believers in Ukraine. So this idea of a Russian civilization with transnational orientation and informed by religion raises all sorts of questions and problems for the existing nation-state order, and also who would belong and in what ways they would be included, excluded, have equality before the state, or certainly inequality before the state, if defined in these religious terms, okay? We want to think about, in terms of the war in Ukraine, we know that Russia is explicitly instrumentalizing religion as a soft tool to support soft power tool to support hard power actions. But we also see inside Ukraine interesting things happening when it comes to the use of religion. We see a phenomenon we see in other parts of the world, the sacralization of the nation, okay? This discussion about Ukrainian identity that takes on sacred terms, transcendent terms, operates according to religious logics. Ukrainian territory is sacred and must be defended as sacred territory, okay? So even if we're talking about secular or non-religious forms of nationalism, oftentimes they take on the same logics and discourses of explicitly forms of nationalism. And we see some of that at work in Ukraine, and we also see some of the religious forms of nationalism at work in Ukraine. And one example of that is the recent decision by President Zelensky to support the recommendation of the National Security Council to designate as threats to national security and therefore limit the operations of Ukrainian Orthodox churches and their leaders who don't belong to this autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And that's concerning because it raises all sorts of religious freedom, freedom of conscience, belief, and religion questions, okay? So I'm throwing out just a bunch of things related to Ukraine, religion, and nationalism. Let me give you another example. I have 5 minutes to go. Another example that I wanted to touch on was Turkey. And what we see in the case of Turkey, again, another case very much in the news, is the emergence in the last 2 decades under the Justice and Development Party, the AKP of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, basically 2 decades in the century of the history of the Republic of Turkey. We see the emergence of an explicitly religiously inflected form of nationalism. So to be a member of the political community of the nation in Turkey under the AKP government regime, I would say, means that you must be a Sunni Muslim. That means that if you're a non-Muslim, for the remnant Christian communities who were not obliterated in the genocide, that's Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian, but also for the myriad other small Christian communities, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and especially for the very sizable, what are called non-conforming Muslim, from a Sunni perspective, Muslims community, that is Alawites in Turkey. They are second class at best in terms of their membership in the national political community. Or to go back this morning to the presentation by Professor Milanas, they are viewed as fifth columns. They're seen as enemies of the state by virtue of what? Their religious designation, okay? So what we're seeing now in the last 2 decades in Turkey is the explicit use and reconfiguration of the nation by the state in religious terms, religiously exclusivist terms. But interestingly enough, and here I go back to Alfred Stepan, the late Alfred Stepan, we see that religion also informed the concept of political community or nation under the successive so-called secular regimes that emerged with Mustafa Kemal. Because it was Kemal, after all, who commissioned a whole cadre of Turkish scholars to develop what was called the Turkish historical thesis. It was, developed and disseminated in the Turkish Review of Anthropology, whereby membership in the Turkish nation turned not only on Turkish ethnicity or the Turkish race as a master race, and this is the language used, but also on membership in the Sunni Muslim community. And we see, in terms of state institutions in Turkey, the building on an expansion of that ideology, but those institutions, namely the Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and the Vakiflar, the Ministry of Foundations in Turkey. And this explicitly religious version of nationalism in Turkey today calls on It's called Neo-Ottoman because it calls on a reconstitution of the Ottoman model, the Ottoman imperial model, whereby there were hierarchies of equality or inequality vis-a-vis the state. And also it has implications for a rejection of current territorial boundaries and a reconfiguration in the form of a greater Turkey, now called Turkey, no longer Turkey. And that helps us to understand what's happened in Turkish-occupied Cyprus. It helps us to understand Turkey's occupation of northern Syria. And it also helps us to understand the events surrounding the reversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque in the summer of 2020, when Imam Ali Erbash, the head imam in the Diyanet, climbed the minbar in Hagia Sophia with a sword. And he said, this is the sword of reconquest of the Hagia Sophia. And this is the first step to what? The reconquest of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, so we see the consequences of a reconfigured nationalism that explicitly turns on religious inclusion or exclusion, not only for domestic politics, but also for international relations. Let me say a bit about India and the US and I'll be done. Okay, India. What do we see happening in India? We see under the the tenure of the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was the former governor of Gujarat province in India, where some of the worst excesses of violence were perpetrated on the Muslim community of Gujarat. We see the deliberate and explicit Hinduization of Indian nationalism. So a turn away from 75 years after the horrific partition of the Indian subcontinent into the states of India and Pakistan, we see a turn away from a religiously plural, citizenship-based form of national identity to an explicitly religious form of identity that is exclusivist, based on membership in the Hindu community. And that's having very corrosive effects domestically on democracy and equality before the state, but it's also having foreign policy consequences in terms of the contested space of Kashmir and elsewhere in the region. And then finally, regarding the United States. We talked about this earlier this morning, but what we see in the US is the emergence of explicit identity forms of nationalism, that also play on and make use of, both by religious and secular leaders, the significance of religion and membership in the religious community. So we see the emergence of this phenomenon of what some call Christian nationalism that is related in many ways to certain interpretations, theological interpretations by evangelical Protestants. So one form of identity nationalism that plays on religion, and another form of identity nationalism that talks about other forms of identity communities, whether they're race or gender, and that in many ways rejects religion. So in the United States, we're seeing a turn towards religious, towards identity forms of nationalism at the expense of civic forms of nationalism. And simultaneously with that, we're seeing, a push to reevaluate the role of religion in the formation of American nationalism that's meant to be premised on equality before the state. The significance historically of Protestant Christianity, the challenges of broadening a form of national identity that draws on the well springs of Protestantism. If we look at the experience of Roman Catholics and then others, Jews, other Christians, Muslims, other faith traditions in the US, we see the brittleness at times, but until recently, the relative adaptability of America's political community of the nation to a format that includes multiple religious communities or no believers. But we're beginning to see a breakdown in that. And we can talk more about that. But I raise all of these to then get to my concluding takeaways for us to think about. What does all this mean? One, simple things. One, get beyond the secularist bias that somehow has written religion out of the story of the nation state, and realized that religion has been and continues to be part of the formation and the functioning of the nation state, both positively and negatively. So think about contingencies. 2, recognize the importance of pluralism and democracy. They matter more than anything else when we're thinking about the place of religion in the construction of political communities, of nationalism. That where priority is placed on democracy, that is equality before the law and rule of law, we see that religion may play a role, and we may see religious dimensions of nationalism, but in ways that are not exclusive, and certainly that reject hierarchies of equality before the state, and certainly that reject violence. Also, third thing, states need to take action and use the legal remedies and fora at their disposal in the face of threats that emerge from religious communities or political leaders who instrumentalize religion for purposes of exclusive nationalism. And this morning, and I see we have Ambassador Darcevic on the screen. This morning we referenced, the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and the way in which, the horrible big three of Tudjman, Milosevic, and Izetbegovic all instrumentalized religion. Political leaders, in the case of Izetbegovic, also religious leader, they instrumentalized religion for purposes of politics and geopolitics. Okay, so use legal remedies and fora at our disposal to address that instrumentalization of religion by political leaders and by religious leaders. Recognize also that religious communities in many ways can play very positive roles in terms of the discourse of inclusion and in terms of advocating for and mobilizing for inclusivity and rejecting exclusivity and forms of nationalism, whether religious or non-religious, that perpetuate inequality. And we, have the, well-known examples of Martin Luther King or Desmond Tutu or Mahatma Gandhi, but there are countless others where we see faith communities and religious communities as advocates of forms of nationalism that are consistent with what? Democracy and pluralism. And then finally, look for opportunities where tensions can be overcome and where forms of inclusion can be given pride of place. And here I would ask us to think about a couple of things: the significance of religious and cultural sites. And I mentioned Hagia Sophia, but also we can think about Al-Aqsa on the Temple Mount. We can think about the Babri Mosque or Ram Temple in Ayodhya, India. We can think about Native American sites in the US and the sacredness of Native American sites and their connection to physical land for Native Americans. That's one example. So religious and cultural sites, and then textbooks and public education and the messages that are sent about religion and belonging to the political community of hopefully democratic regimes. And then finally, think about the reality that climate disruption and violence, but in particular climate disruption, is going to produce ever greater degrees of people on the move. And we're seeing it worldwide, which means what? The religious diversification and pluralization of societies, which means that nations are going to become ever more diverse. And that means that states need to be accountable for and protective of that religious diversity and the diversity of non-belief as well in the political communities that we know as a nation. So I'll stop there.
Simply, wow. Very nicely done. I will, I can go on, but I think there are questions abound, and I know Ambassador Garcevic has a couple of questions. So, Vesco, I think you can ask your own question, but there's a question there by Isaac as well on the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Elizabeth. Maybe you can answer that question while Ambassador Garcevic gets his camera on, and I'm sure Mr. Danis has some thoughts on this as well. So we'll try to get everybody in the conversation.
Okay, sure. And apologies for drinking my Starbucks, but I'm struggling with a cold and my voice is
It's the
hoarse.
evil
So,
empire, as
yeah.
far as I'm concerned, but I love it. So
Okay,
I
okay.
embrace the evil
Okay.
empire.
Okay, okay. Well, I feel better. I'm in good company. Okay. Yeah, so I think, let's see, Isak Road, I think my question has been answered, but you asked about what are some of the best ways to counteract the rise of trends of religious nationalism, around the world. And as I mentioned, I think, first of all, to get beyond this notion that religion is a dirty word, right? And that religion, it has always been and must necessarily be associated with exclusivism, division, and conflict. And certainly there are myriad, examples to support that claim, but some of the most grotesque excesses in the name of nationalism perpetrated by states have been, in the name of secularism. So think about, Mao's Cultural Revolution, or think about, the Soviet Union and, state socialist regimes, officially atheist regimes like Enver Hoxha's Albania, or think about the excesses of Kemalist Turkey. These are examples where, under the rubric of secularity and secular forms of nationalism, horrific kinds of violations of human rights, civil liberties were perpetrated. Religion having little to do with those actions. I think that's one thing. The second thing is also to recognize that secular forms of nationalism can oftentimes, operate with the same exclusivist, oppressive, not intolerant, logics and mechanisms that explicitly religious forms of nationalism do. And I just mentioned some of those. So we have to think about our vocabulary. And then finally, yeah, I think we need to recognize that, religious communities are everywhere. Faith communities are everywhere, in particular, with existential issues like climate disruption, global pandemics, the threat of WMDs in so many forms. Faith communities play a great role in the world today. And so identifying those faith communities who are positive stakeholders in inclusivist forms of nationalism, and those who can be threats, is really important. So we need to sort of do a mapping of the environment in which we operate and connect with those stakeholders who support inclusivism and democracy and pluralism, and recognize that there are, naysayers and threats that we also need to take into account too. But don't essentialize all religious communities, either negatively or positively.
Yeah, Vasco, you have a question? Ambassador Garcevic? We can't hear you. Turn on your.
I paused my. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. Excellent presentation. Really, how to say it, thoughtful, provocative, engaging. I enjoyed very much. So I pose a question so you can see the question. Just a comment about religion. I think that religion itself, at least from my perspective, religion, particularly faith, but religion included, is not either positive or negative, but what happens is which makes, in fact, problems or challenges is weaponization or instrumentalization or politicization of religion, and it's often done by religious leaders, not all of them, but blaming devout Christians or devout Muslims or devout Hindu people or devout I don't know whom for what have been done in the name of their religions is definitely just perpetuates the conflict and this like a narrow perception of how religions are behind conflicts. But my question about my question is more about the first part of your presentation. So since you mentioned that after 1989, since the end of a bipolar world, and particularly in the last decade of the 20th century, and I would say the first decade to some extent of the 21st century, we were living the time of, let's say, as you described, cosmopolitanism, which means the understanding that there is something beyond all national identity or all narrow identities, something which actually we all have in common. Besides the fact that we can always use this as a good phrase to describe how we humans have something in common. But the current trend in the last, which you also described in the second part of your presentation, current trend actually challenges that. I would say that we are living now revival, we can call it even resurrection, whatever, of this state-centered system or national state system, or national states as main actors in global affairs, which means we are going back to our narrow identities back, and we feel safer, I would say, more at home in that context. What do you think? What is behind that? How would you explain that?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a huge question. So a few just basic things. And I was writing these notes. I think, 1989, the euphoria of the end of the Cold War. I think by now, 3 decades on, we realize that some of that, or 2.5, whatever it is, I'm bad at math. But anyway, that euphoria was overblown. And I think in particular, sort of the idea that with the end of the Cold War and the seemingly, universal triumph of democracy, that the nation state would be a thing of the past. I think, that prediction of the end of the nation state was dramatically premature, and I think, one of the reasons perhaps that we see maybe a default to, and in some ways, paradoxically, a reconsolidation of the nation state. I think the answers for that are, some of them are as follows. One is the easy answer, I think, is the relatively grotesque failure of international organizations that are meant to uphold international law, or regional organizations that are meant to do the same, and particularly hold accountable perpetrators of violence domestically and interstate. Those failures mean that people look then to states, or they reject their states. But at the end of the day, states are still the only game in town. There's not been a strengthening of international organizations like the United Nations, for example, or international courts that would help people buy into and feel trust in the notion of a cosmopolitan global community where everyone is held accountable and everyone is equally protected before these transnational post-state institutions. So I think that's one example. The second, and again, the Russia-Ukraine, I work on the East Med a lot. So, the tragedy of the Russian war in Ukraine, and holds up, pours into sharp relief the fact that, Russia is a grotesque violator of the sovereignty of Ukraine and, a disruptor of the rules-based international order. But, it forces us to sort of look ourselves as international community in the mirror and realize that certainly Russia is not the only violator. And so, the failure to recognize that inconsistency means that those who are opposed to the kind of inclusivism and democracy that would presumably support cosmopolitanism say, oh, this is just a bunch of rhetoric. And we really are still, in the era of nation state geopolitical competition. And again, working on the East Med, I think it's really interesting that if we were to make 2 columns and put Russia on one side and Turkey on the other side, and the kinds of domestic and foreign policy, violations that are perpetrated by both Moscow and Ankara, I mean, we'd have really, very similar things. The only difference is that Turkey's a NATO member state, and part of a transatlantic alliance that's supposed to oppose these violations. So failures of international institutions. Secondly, the other big, I think, challenge that we see in the post-Cold War period is the fact that the neoliberal economic order has produced grotesque economic differences, and that those economic differences people seek refuge from or respite for, or they express their grievances vis-a-vis those institutional loci of power that they know, and that's their states, whether local or national. So states again become the focal point for how people express their grievances for the failures of the neoliberal economic model to make all of us, part of this human community where everybody is equally valued and has dignity in terms of the kinds of things we associate with dignified housing, right to work, etc. So the failures and the disequilibria of the neoliberal economic model. And then the third reason I think that, the nation state continues to be important and can be important is for issues of judicial practice, excuse me, and rule of law. If people are seeking recourse, they can go to courts.
Well, maybe maybe we can help you
Have a
out.
little
Yeah,
a glass
sorry.
of water.
So, yes, Mr.
Oh,
Danis,
local,
you can
yeah.
go ahead,
So,
Mr. Danis.
Have a little glass of water, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, thank you very, very much. I really enjoy the speeches and the educational process that I'm receiving from everyone. And one of the things my background and thought is, how do we fix it? We need to fix some of these issues, and how do we do that? And we're talking about religious organizations and how those have come to play for the exact reasons that Professor Elizabeth Prodromou pointed out through the years. Then we have the nationalism. Nationalism is almost a natural phenomenon. Every living creature on this planet has that feeling of nationalism to their own home. And my point on that is, how do we fix it? And that's how. And so there are two areas, two institutions. One is the governing institutions, and the other is the education institution, to really promote a planet citizenship. I always look at it as, I'm a citizen of the planet, of this earth, rather than a citizen of previous citizen of Greece, and now a citizen, two citizenship, and one in the United States of America. But I'm here as a visitor, but my responsibility is to the planet. So that's nationalism needs to be the educational and policy makers need to really look at that, because we're really promoting the big players, the United States, Russia, China, and the European Union, and the Middle East countries. Everybody's promote nationalism because they are going after, Russia goes after Ukraine. So you're going to develop that nationalism more and more to try to protect your entity, your borders and your territory. So how do we fix that? The other part, which is interesting, the religion organizations and the international organizations are really in conflict, because you have now many chiefs, and so they're overwhelming each other to the point that, so how do we fix these things? Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody.
Sure, okay, thank you. And again, sorry for my coughing spell. I've made some notes. I think where religion figures into this, let me start with that. I think given the nature of the global nature of existential problems that face all of us on the planet, I think it's absolutely crucial that we identify as many stakeholders as possible who can offer solutions. And again, for your students who are listening, I would ask you to do some research on the concept of wickedness. For those of you who work in chaos theory, maybe in the sciences, or in conflict resolution, and you see the notion of wicked problems. These are problems which have multiple causes. They are problems which don't have a single solution and may not have any final solution. Therefore, they require multiple stakeholders in different sectors to be cooperating in managing the problem. And here, religious communities are part of them. So if we're thinking about problems like climate disruption, if we're thinking about weapons of mass destruction, if we're thinking about pandemics, I mean, these are kind of the big three that threaten all humanity all the time, every day, then we need as many stakeholders as possible in terms of addressing the problems locally and globally. That's why, and so faith communities can be part of that. And I'll give some concrete examples. And in the case of pandemic issues, we know, for example, that religious communities in West Africa during Ebola were absolutely important in educating their constituents about how to handle the bodies of their dead, so that they would not spread Ebola. Or I know from an example that I saw up close when I served on the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. We were in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur population is concentrated in Western China. And we met with the Grand Imam, and they told us about a program with Uyghurs in Australia and Uyghurs in Western China about educating their communicants about sexually transmitted diseases. And where did they do that? They were doing it through the mosques. Okay, so they were speaking to them and they were providing them with educational material. So these are two examples of how it is that faith communities can help in these existential issues that affect all humanity, or sadly enough, as from my perspective anyway, as we've seen in the COVID pandemic, the way that faith communities can impede solutions that can protect everyone. The other thing too, I would say, is education, the absolutely critical importance of access to education for all, and also the quality of textbooks and the quality of teachers. It's not enough to get them in schools. It also depends on who's doing the teaching, and also what are students consuming in terms of their textbooks. So, and either, send messages of exclusivist nationalism, photographs, images, or explicit text about fifth columns, who are, religious others, and incitements to violence. So you need good teachers, and you need good textbooks, and you need access. So investing in education, which is a long-term project, there are no easy fixes, but it's absolutely essential. And then finally, the last thing that I think is important is on leadership. Who speaks for religious communities? And there we need to talk about reform and change and pluralism within religious communities, so that there is inclusion, and there's, by virtue of that, contestation about religious ideas, interpretation, and practice. And here, as a woman, I would say particularly important is the inclusion of women in decision-making structures in faith communities, where decisions can mean the difference oftentimes between life and death, and certainly access to education and access to so many other fundamental human rights. So investing in leadership programs inside faith communities, because those faith communities live in broader social communities and national communities. And if you're talking about a faith community that operates in a Manichaean sense of good, evil, inclusion, exclusion, those messages are going to make their way out into broader social communities. And I say that also because I've been doing some faith-based leadership with the support of the State Department, and it's been really fascinating. Can I add a footnote? The media, we've not talked about the media, but the irresponsibility of media in the United States, I would say, that functions more like entertainment, and where the media in some ways is abdicating its role as the fourth estate, informing and educating, rather than treating these kinds of issues that bring us all here today as almost bread and circus. I think that's another big issue. So the separation of media from state, and the healthy functioning of media.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. The media is advocating their responsibilities as an informative institution. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think to jump in here, and I think that those points are well taken. It's it's almost like also recasting the conversation as we're having. I mean, this is Elizabeth, you make this very valid point at a time when everybody's talking about chat box 4.0 coming out, and social sciences and humanities being sort of like pushed aside in favor of STEM, and the whole discussion of the last 25 years of neoliberalism that has taken the sort of like the dimensions of Ayn Rand's world of rationalization and objectivism without kind of a religious framing. And I think it's the very first step, and I couldn't agree more with the prescriptions that you gave, but the very first step is sort of like, re-engaging in this conversation in the way we're trying to, even at this point, where, some of these things have to be brought back in the mainframe of discussion. Right. So this issue of religion and, even like, when it comes up, a lot of people just like as a mere reaction, it's just sort of like, being put off by it, but to sort of like knead it back into that civic engagement and that civic space in a productive manner, it takes a lot. And, you're talking about the possibilities of universities not being around in 30 years if we're going the way that we're going, as far as, this AI revolution that's upon us. And it's not something that's coming, that's something that's upon us right now. And I think we're all feeling it, and we'll be feeling it even more so. So, all of this discussion about great teachers, about great content, about leadership and all these things, these are great. And I think that, I couldn't agree more. And I think they're even our audience, but how do we deal with that in that kind of a landscape? I was in a panel a few years ago, and I think maybe some people who are on here, we're talking about nationalism, and the co-panelist, somebody, who's, well-respected academic, said, nationalism will be over in the next 4 years. That's the assessment, and that's the framing of this conversation, as it exists right now, unless we are reversing that. Yeah. We have 2 minutes, so the floor is yours, Elizabeth, unless somebody wants to just jump in and have a question or.
I just want to thank everybody. First of all, Petro, you and George, for making all of this possible. And also, Isak, I look forward to meeting you in person, and Vesco as well. But for the students who are listening, this is your world. And I would say, as Mr. Danis said earlier, you have the opportunity to, and I think you have the existential need to be informed, engaged citizens. You're inheriting this world, and you can, you must be active shapers of the world rather than, passive reactors to the world, and hold people accountable, and hold yourselves accountable. Hold, those who you learn from accountable, but also test yourselves and hold yourselves accountable, and get off your devices and talk to each other and read. Because all of this conversation about a global community is really wonderful, but you cannot have a global community if that exists, only in the device in your hand. And because that is, in some ways, the greatest sort of disintegrating force, paradoxically. And this goes to your question, Vesco. We thought technologies, and Petros, what you just said, would be a form of, collective integration, and instead we're seeing technology in some ways function as a form of atomistic disintegration. So for all of you, students on screen, just, grasp this world because it's yours.
Exactly. Elizabeth, thank you very much. Really, I again wanted to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. The religion part, a quick note that when I first came, I was very young, came to this country, the religion was a heaven for me, and an institution that it helped me sustain and be able to survive in a different world. So it is very important. And of course, the young generation, get off your, as Elizabeth pointed out, get off your screen and start communicating, and start looking what you need to do in order to sustain this planet and be a part of that solution, rather than continue to condone the problem.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Vesco. Thank you, Isaac. Thank you to all the people that have who are partners here. This is not an individual attempt in any way, shape, or form. And we have like a nice framing today with two very nice presentations. Tomorrow we'll be going a little bit into Cyprus and Turkish foreign policy.